You might be the best IB student in the world, destined to get a 45 out of 45, to finish the IB in 6 months, taking 6 HLs, to rediscover the cell in your biology IA, and to invent a new economic theory in your economics IA. But if you go to the wrong school, or to a bad IB school, then regardless of how good you might be, you can say goodbye to all of that. Hey there, my name is Emiliano, and retrospectively, I really enjoyed the IB school where I did the IB. Alright, I was being dramatic at the beginning, but we are byproducts of our environment. So if you pick a good school, then you're more or less set in terms of the environment that you can procure for yourself, and the rest is in your hands. But if you pick a not so good school, then you might be off to a bad beginning, middle, and end. So let's look at some of the traits that bad IB schools have so that you can look out to them and avoid them. There's only 7 of these characteristics, so make sure to stay until the end so you can really know which ones you should be looking at. The first one is an abysmal track record. If the school you're considering has a track record that will make your parents cry, then that might not be the best place for you. By this I mean that if it has historically low grades and is consistently terrible academically, then odds are that you won't do very well academically there either. Of course, there are always outliers and students that do well despite of their environment, but there is no guarantee that that will be you or that that will happen because they are outliers after all. So instead of punishing yourself by going to a IB school that historically does badly, that further indicates that you might do badly, try to go to an IB school that does quite well. That way, you are also guaranteed to do better than if you went to a bad IB school. Number 2 is an abysmal pass rate. The pass rate for the IB globally is around 80%. That means that around 20% or 1 in 5 people don't pass the IB. But this isn't distributed equally throughout schools throughout the whole world. So for example, my school had around 44 students in my class, of which, if I recall correctly, around 4 didn't pass, which is just around 9%. But I do know of a school here in Mexico that has a 50% pass rate or a 50% fail rate. That's not a very good sign. A bad pass rate can mean a lot of things, none of which are good. So please, if the school you're considering has a pass/fail rate above 20%, then its badness is above average, which means that its academics are actually below average. It's just bad. Don't do that to yourself. Go somewhere else if you can. Number 3 is a constant and consistent staff turnover. Staff happiness equals a good school environment, which is a necessity when it comes to a good learning and teaching environment. Staff unhappiness equals staff leaving and being replaced constantly. This can mean a lot of things like bad pay, clashes with management, no dental. Whatever the case, it paints the picture of unhappy teachers, which isn't what you want from the 6 people that are in charge of making you pass the IB at a good enough level so that you have a future and you can get into a university. In other words, unhappy teachers eventually equals to unhappy students because you're not learning well, etc. If teachers are constantly leaving or being replaced or being fired or whatever the reason, if there is no stability in teachers, first of all, there won't be a stability in your life because you won't know if your current German teacher will be the same teacher in 2 months, or if your current math teacher will be the same teacher that you will have in 4 months, or if this new teacher that just came in to sub the arts teacher might have the same teaching methods as the previous teacher, etc. It's just not a good learning environment for you, and you'll be stressed more than you already will be because of the IB. And there won't be a sense of continuity as to what you've been taught because obviously different teachers have different ways of teaching. So if you're being interrupted every time you're learning something new or halfway through things, well then that's just no good at all. Another thing is multitasking teachers. Now I don't mean multitasking in the traditional sense of that they're texting and driving or that they're giving a presentation on biology and FaceTiming their cousins. I mean multitasking in the sense that there might not be enough teachers or they're just spread out too thin. This can happen for 2 main reasons. The first one is that there aren't enough teachers, which can happen for the reasons that I explained before. And the second one is that the school is poorly organized. Whatever the reason, what you'll end up with is, for example, a TOK teacher that also teaches math and German literature. And they do that at a very surface level because honestly, IB subjects are really in-depth and you really need to dive into them, and you need a teacher that's committed. So if the teacher is spread out between 2 or 3 different subjects, odds are they're not teaching any of those subjects well or at a sufficient enough level for their students to really succeed or be above average. And if they're not being taught well or at a sufficient enough level, then the person that eventually suffers won't be the teacher because they're already teaching, they've done their job, etc. It's you, the student, who will have to sit the examinations either in May or November, and who will come to realize you haven't learned everything you need to know. You also have to know if the school is a good fit for you, and I'm going to talk about rules right now. Obviously, there are some rules that you will have to abide to, but there might be some rules that you personally don't agree with and that might be non-negotiables to you. So for example, if a school has a dress code that doesn't allow girls and female students to show their shoulders for whatever reason, and you think that that's outdated and a red flag as to what the school's mentality is, as well as sexist and objectifying, for example, then you might decide that that school is not for you and it's not the right fit. Don't think that just because you don't like a rule, you won't have to abide to it. You will. So instead of saying, I will enroll here and I just won't pay attention to that rule, save yourself the trouble and just don't go to that school. Choose another school that you might be more happy with, that doesn't have rules that you don't agree with such intensity. Of course, bear in mind that all schools will have rules and you will have to abide by them. Just use your own criteria and your own reason to navigate these waters. Another sign of a bad school or a bad IB school is student-teacher relationships. Now, this doesn't mean romantic relationships, just that any relationship between a student and a staff member is a power dynamic. There is a certain power imbalance there. That means there can't be an equality of circumstances. So it's a bit iffy. It's a gray area that if the school isn't really enforcing or isn't being strict or firm with, it might be a place to avoid. It's not inherently bad. It just can lead to murky situations that aren't ideal, and if the school isn't doing anything about it, then that speaks to the management that might be turning a blind eye. It might turn to the lack of support systems that students might have. It might talk about the power imbalance between students and staff and how that's being managed. It can just point to a lot of different red flags that you want to avoid. Lastly, I'm going to talk about constant conflict. Now, there are 3 main relationships where that could arise, and I'm gonna go through each of them. But yeah, the first one is constant conflict between staff members. Now, there's nothing more toxic than an environment in which teachers are constantly being in conflict and like having issues with each other, especially in front of students. It can, of course, lead to diminished quality of teaching and a more stressful environment for students to be around or to be in. Now, teachers don't have to like themselves or even be best friends or anything, but you should expect a certain degree of cordiality and respect, at least so that propriety is maintained within the school and the school grounds. Anything that happens outside of school is none of the students' business, really, as long as it's not affecting their learning and the relationships within school. Signs for conflict between staff members can be manifested by staff complaining about other staff in front of students, harassment of staff to other staff in front of students, disrespect, or other types of clashing, mostly in front of students. Number 2 is a clash or conflict between staff and students. Now, a constant clash or conflict between students and staff can show a lack of respect that students have for staff, which in turn shows a sort of lack of authority. And this weakness of authority arises from a lack of boundaries or a lack of enforcement of boundaries from the staff, which in turn is not a suitable environment for learning. On the other hand, if the staff are constantly clashing with students and the staff is responsible, well then again it's a power imbalance of the staff mistreating students, which again is a huge red flag and not something you want to be a part of. And finally, the third conflict is a constant conflict between management and the rest of the school community, mostly the staff. Mostly, I would assume that when this type of conflict arises is because the management is slightly despotic when it comes to wielding their power over the rest of the school community, which is something that the staff and the rest of the school community might not like or might not agree with. This power struggle will result in the staff and the rest of the school community constantly feeling slighted by the school management, which is not an environment conducive to either long-term happiness, if you're constantly feeling slighted by the management, or learning if you're never happy with how school is turning out or how school environment is. So since this conflict will translate to other forms of unhappiness and other forms of conflict in other areas of the school, you might want to avoid this as well. Now, naturally, there will always be conflict between staff and students in management in different directions, etc. However, the key term here is constant, plus you will have to evaluate all of these criteria on a day-to-day basis and see more or less what is enough for you and what you can tolerate, and you will have to draw your own line in the sand as to what is tolerable and what isn't. But of course, you will have to analyze this on a case-to-case basis. There is no such thing as universal advice. So thank you guys again so much for liking, commenting, subscribing. I really appreciate it. You can check out my other videos on the IB up here. You can subscribe here in the middle. You can look at my other videos about IB schools in this corner up here. And yeah, I'll see you guys next week.